Hello, welcome to Religion and Life. I'm your host, Ozzie Ostwalt. I'm happy to be joined today by Dr. Diana Pasulka, who joined us last week to talk about UFOs, technology, and religion. That interview was so fascinating that I wanted to invite her back today to continue the conversation and also to venture off into some of her other work. Welcome, Diana.
Thank you.
I appreciate you joining us again.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
Yeah, so we talked about UFOs, we talked about extraterrestrial life, we talked about religion, and you gave a fascinating talk to our students here, and I'd like to watch just a short segment of that and then continue the conversation,
Sure.
if that's okay.
Yes. This talk is going to be about these connections, about the connections between the real world and the world of technology, and specifically media technologies about galactic characters in UFOs. And so there's a really weird interchange here. And so that's when I first started to realize that, yeah, this is really a weird story, and I'm going to tell it. Well,
that was great. And I want to kind of pick up where we left off. We did talk about UFO and ancient aliens and extraterrestrial intelligence. And we were just getting to the point where you were talking about Martin Heidegger.
That's right.
Talking about a new way of looking at human being, actually.
Yes.
A new framework for understanding what makes us human, how we think, how we act, and so forth. So maybe we could pick up there just a bit and
Sure.
describe what Heidegger is trying to communicate about our unique place in history at this point as a species.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, Heidegger wrote, I find his articles more interesting than his books. His books are pretty hard to get through, but his articles are really fascinating. And he's got two really good articles that really address this idea of technology. One, actually, ironically, is called Origin of the Work of Art. And in this article, he actually talks about eras of humanity. And he basically says that, okay, the Greeks had their temple, and the temple was where the god appears. And the Greeks would go to the temple, and the temple would be the place where the Greeks would sustain their identity as humans. Within the Catholic tradition, the Western tradition, the cathedral was that place where God appears, okay? So Heidegger's basically saying then in What is Technology, his other essay, that this new era that's upon us is the era of technology, and that the human now is somehow so related to technology that it constitutes a new era of the human. And so I think this is fascinating. He also distinguishes between two interpretations of technology, and he cautions humans not to interpret technology just as instrumental. So say you take a hammer and you use it and you put it down. Well, it's an instrument, right?
Sure.
But he says technology is really not so simple. There's something much more vague and intricate about technology and the human relationship to it. And so he talks about that in his, he almost talks about a mystical relationship that we might have with technology.
A mystical relationship of mind and body expansion.
Yes, exactly.
And he's writing this in the 30s and 40s?
Yes, he is, yeah.
Which is before the internet, of course.
Yes.
Before really computers. And he's envisioning, I mean, he's almost prophetic, right?
He is, yes.
So that technology becomes a kind of an extension of the human,
yes.
a way for us to expand beyond who we are now.
Yes.
And that is mystical.
It's very mystical, yeah. So, the engagement with technology is going to, he cautions us. So, Heidegger ends his career with an article, it's actually an interview in Der Spiegel, which is a German magazine. And he asked that the interview only be published posthumously. And he ends the article with a dire warning, really, about technology. And I think that, so we've got the idea of, kind of, there's good and bad here. We've got to be really careful, technology. Think about Frankenstein, right? That's technology out of control. Right. Okay, so that's one narrative. But he gives us, an out. He says, perhaps we can understand technology in a way that won't allow the Frankenstein narrative to play out. And but he also warns us. So he leaves his career with that, and I think that's interesting.
How do we? I don't know if Heidegger answers this or not, but how do we temper our enthusiasm for technology so that we don't go down the Frankenstein path? mean, here we're on the verge of artificial intelligence
Yes,
and some of the
yes.
horrors that we hear about AI. So
Yes,
how do we
yes.
keep on the right path with technology? Does he give us any guidelines or?
Think of who is basically telling us about the horrors of AI, the people who've created it.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
So, we're talking about the Musks of the world and the Zuckerbergs of the world basically saying, we had better be careful here. Okay, so I think we need to be careful. Heidegger doesn't actually help us. He complicates the relationship, and then he basically leaves it at that. And he says, be careful, and gives a dire warning at the end of his life. And so, I wish I could give a more happy answer. But that's how he leaves it.
Well, are the Musk and the Zuckerbergs our new ethicists and our new prophets? I mean, are those the people we need to be listening to like we would have listened to theologians in times past?
No.
No? Okay, all right.
I don't think so.
Okay, all
I
right.
think they've created it and then they step back and they say, what have I done?
All right.
Kind of like Frankenstein, right?
Yeah.
Like, what have I created? Dr. Frankenstein is a
Right.
brilliant young scientist. So the question is, with our engagement with science, which has been great, right, and has also been bad. So there are good and bad aspects to it. How does that fit with how we view the sacred today?
Right.
Okay. So the new sacred today is the technological aerial phenomena. It's advanced. It's from non-human intelligence that we assume are smarter than us, right? We can't get them, right? They come down, they scare us a bit, and they leave, right? So this is the new sacred that we can never pin down, because the sacred can never be reduced, right? It's always going to be transcendent. That's a word we use in religious studies. It's always going to transcend our capacity. It's infinite a lot. It's like the infinite, and we're finite. We have finite brains. But we can grok what the infinite is, but we can't pin it down. So this is our
Heinlein.
What?
The word grok.
Oh, right, yeah.
Right, yeah. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, that's quite all right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this, so the new sacred shows up as this aerial phenomenon. That's advanced technology.
So these are our new deities in a sense.
Yes.
In this new technological framework. So they are the artificial or the alien intelligences become our new deities. They become the other for us now, to use another word that we use in religious studies.
It's the other.
So, but part of our interaction with the other not only points out our own finitude, but also gives us aspirations, right?
Yes,
Toward
absolutely.
infinity. So
yeah.
It seems like part of our aspiration in the face of alien intelligence would be to expand our own minds, and you use the word mind or the phrase mind expansion. Could you talk a little bit about another person that has been instrumental in your research, Jacques Vallee?
Yes.
And how his work intersecting with your work leads to this notion of mind expansion and what our future might be like.
Sure. So Jacques is one of the most fascinating people I've met. He has a Ph.D. from Northwestern in computer science, and this is, in the 1960s and 70s that he got this. He's also an astronomer, and he's French. He's a French citizen, but he lives in the Bay Area. And he was a person who had worked on ARPANET, which was the precursor to our internet. And at the same time that he worked on that, he was also involved with the Stanford Research Institute, which was affiliated back at that time with Stanford. But they did really interesting work on telepathy and remote viewing. So at the same time that Jacques was working on the proto-internet, he was also working in this field of remote viewing. So in a sense,
and by remote viewing, telepathy, something we might call extrasensory perception, this
Yes.
type of communication using the mind and not through other verbal forms. Okay, I just wanted to make sure I had the terminology right. Yeah.
Remote viewing is basically accessing information through means that we don't understand. So how did this person come to this idea and know this when they didn't read it, see it, nobody told them, right? So it's we just don't understand how it works, okay? So this is remote viewing. And Annie Jacobson actually wrote a really good book just recently called Phenomenon, where she actually does a little history of, or it's actually not a little history, it's a very good book about the Stanford Research Institute and the people that worked and were involved with that. And that our government, was involved with this. So Jacques was part of this. Now, Jacques is really interesting. I would consider him a mentor of mine. So early on in my research from Catholicism to the UFO topic, I met Jacques and realized that in a sense he was really what Heidegger had talked about, right? He was almost like a manifestation of a person who had a mystical engagement with technology. And so I read all of Jacques' work. Jacques was actually featured in Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind. He's the French scientist, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So that's Jacques.
So the French scientist is based on Jacques.
Yes, it's based on Jacques. Yeah, and so Jacques has written a whole body of work, and one of the first books he wrote about the phenomena. Now he's an astronomer, so he actually saw some unidentified aerial phenomena, and that really sparked his interest. Right? He wanted to know why. He also wanted to know why his government threw away that data. Okay, he wanted to know why. And so he began to study this. And it took him actually to the French National Library. And so Jacques, having a classical education, was able to translate Latin. And so he went back and he looked at the sources from Catholic history that talked about aerial phenomena. And he did an analysis of it from the framework of, what are these aerial phenomena, incidents, and we can trace a history of these. And actually his last book, so then he went into and he's written a lot of books, he's prodigious, and has many, many books on the phenomena. And then his last book, called Wonders in the Sky, is another analysis going back even further and looking at other traditions as well, and looking at the aerial phenomena in those traditions.
One of the things this interview has done for me is added a lot of books to my must-read list.
Yes,
so.
Yeah.
All right,
That's
so a couple of times you have mentioned that your interest in technology and UFOs really came out of your work with medieval Catholicism. I can't let you go without
really
segueing to
Yeah,
this work.
yeah.
So you have a previous book. Could you give me the title of that? And it's
Sure.
on Purgatory, actually. So.
Yes, it's. I'm a historian of the Catholic tradition, and this book is a book about the doctrine of purgatory, and it's called Heaven Can Wait, Purgatory and Catholic Devotional Culture.
Okay, so that's a heavy title.
I know.
Yeah, but it's a really interesting work. So I want to explore the connection that you see between this work with medieval Catholicism and your current work with technology and UFOs. But a couple of questions come to mind, particularly for those who might not be familiar with purgatory. What is purgatory? Where is purgatory?
Right.
How did the idea come into the Catholic theological system? Those sorts of questions. So what is purgatory?
Okay, so purgatory for Catholics is an afterlife destination for souls that aren't quite good enough to get into heaven, but they're not going to the other place. Okay,
right.
So it's kind of like a way station for these souls. And the doctrine was actually not really codified until the 1200s. So Christianity had been around for like that long before it was actually codified. And then there were devotions and practices within the Catholic tradition that honored the souls in purgatory until the 1960s, okay? And then we had what is called Vatican II, which was a reorganization of the Catholic Church in the 1960s. And then after that, purgatory fell away as something that Catholics believed in and something that they practiced. Like there were prayers to the souls in purgatory, or for the souls in purgatory, so that they could have a better time and get into heaven quicker, right? And so really that's what these prayers were about. Now, my question was, as a historian of the Catholic tradition, first, why did we codify this place? And second, why don't we practice it today? Like, where did purgatory go? And that was my question. Now, what I found out was that there were places of purgatory in all throughout the early medieval time period. And one was in Ireland, and it's still around. It's in Loch Derg.
So there's an actual place on this earth in Ireland that the Catholic Church at one time said that's where purgatory is.
Well, the Catholic Church is really careful to ever say something like this is where purgatory is.
Right.
But many Catholics went to this place.
So it's kind of a popular folk
It was
belief.
And there were purgatory caves. So these were places where people would go into the ground and they would fast and they would pray and they would do, it was an ascetic practice. And if you were particularly bad, say you've murdered somebody, the local priest would say you must go to Loch Derg and go through this punishment. And you go and you
so you can murder someone and still go to purgatory.
Gosh, yeah,
okay.
I know, it's so bad, yeah.
Well,
this is the case.
So I'm beginning to see why the doctrine of purgatory would be attractive and why it may have come out of the, you said it comes out of the popular culture originally, not necessarily from the Catholic elite or the theological elite.
Well, both, it was a both type of thing.
So it's an attractive doctrine because I think, as you said, it gives humanity a bit of an out for those of us who can't live the saintly life and hope for immediate entrance into heaven, but consider ourselves not bad enough to be eternally punished.
Right.
It's a second chance of sorts. Is that?
Well, yeah. So let's talk about why it was popular.
Yeah. Okay.
So it was not just popular for that reason, but it was also popular because it was really interesting.
Sure.
So people could go into these purgatory caves, and sometimes they would come out with extraordinary experiences of meeting demons and running from them and having angels help them. So it was really like there was a bestseller that was based on going into this purgatory cave at Loch Derg in the, let's see, this was in, it's the 1200s and 1300s. And it predated Dante. And in fact, Dante says purgatory is this island, right? And purgatory was associated with this place on Ireland, So there's a lot of correlation that was lost, that we don't know about. And I uncover all of that and show really where does this doctrine come from. And I think part of the reason why it took was because of the interesting tales and stories that arose out of, going down into this cave. Once you got into the cave then supposedly, this is the tale, would open up into this amazing, almost like hell, right? And you would see people being tortured, and this, purgatory was a pretty terrible place, right?
Right.
And so you would go through there and you would have to survive it. And then by the time you got out, think of the kinds of pop cultural narratives we see today on TV where people, Survivor, right? So you've got Survivor where, this was kind of like a, medieval Survivor.
Right.
But the stakes were higher because this is your soul, right? This isn't your body, this is your soul.
Right.
And so they'd come out and they'd tell the tale, and then they'd make copies of it in, oral tradition. And in fact, there's so many copies of this one narrative of a knight going into the purgatory and coming out that we have to assume that it was just an absolute bestseller. It was like the Da Vinci Code or something, medieval Da Vinci Code. And to me, I think this is probably more contributory to purgatories being created as a doctrine than anything.
But it's coming out of the popular imagination.
It really is, yeah.
Even though it might have official church support, it's coming out of the popular imagination, being driven by the popular imagination.
Right.
Your medieval cave people,
yeah.
they're like your UFO experiencers, right? They go to this place, and they have this experience, takes them out of their normal reality. It opens up mind-expanding experiences, and they come back, and then they have this mythology or this experience to share with others.
Exactly, and they're completely transformed.
Yeah, so I'm beginning to see the pattern here.
Yes.
In your research. So in the transformation, that's like religious conversion, right?
It is. It's a religious conversion.
So this is a very powerful experience, something that changes lives.
Yes. Yes. So that's part of what interested me in the UFO narrative today. But also, like I had said in our last talk last week, what happened was that I had come across so many instances and records of aerial phenomena, and I really didn't know how to, put those in my book. They don't really have a lot to do with purgatory, other than the fact that a lot of people in the 1800s and down into the 1200s would interpret these aerial phenomena as souls from purgatory.
Right.
And then they would pray for them and that type of thing. Go back to where you're supposed to come. Where you're supposed to be. And so, so I had this long list, and it grew and grew. And I thought, and then finally a non-academic friend of mine suggested these were UFO reports, which I, of course, said no, they're not, but then realized, wow, there are a lot of patterns here.
Right. Well, if medieval Catholicism and purgatory took you to UFOs in the 21st century, it's going to be interesting to see where your UFO research takes you next, right?
Oh, yes. I'm almost afraid of that.
So you mentioned the other end of your research on purgatory, or the other question you asked was why popular devotion to purgatory fell out of favor in the latter part of the 20th century. You mentioned that Vatican II probably had something to do with it, and this was a
huge.
Vatican II, in part, wanted to update Catholicism.
Yes.
I think open it up to Protestantism, so Protestants don't have a purgatory. I mean, is there something going on there that leads to the devotion to purgatory falling out of favor, or what do you think?
Yeah, I think there are a couple things. One of the things is that this has to do with the material culture of religion. So
Right.
they reorganized the churches. So the older churches, the pre-Vatican II churches, actually had a little place where people would actually go for the soul. It was devoted to the souls in purgatory, and people could go there and make their devotions, right? And so what Vatican II did was they changed the churches, so they lost that. So those were completely gone. If you have a material culture that was there and all of a sudden wasn't there, how are young Catholics going to know about it? They just didn't know. Another thing was that this emphasis on punishment and hell, was kind of giving the Catholic Church some bad press. Right? So the Catholic Church was really, apparently, pre-Vatican II, punishment, you might go to a really bad purgatory or something like that. And they realized that this was actually, affecting how many people were Catholic and remained Catholic.
Right.
And so that was, the emphasis on that changed. And now it was more about the poor. The social gospel.
Sure.
Let's feed the poor. Let's actually do what Jesus did, okay? And so that de-emphasized that idea of an afterlife destination, a punitive afterlife
almost
destination.
suppressed then by the hierarchy of the church, in a sense.
Well, some people believe that. I mean, I do interview people in my book in the last chapter who believe that it's a conspiracy to suppress the afterlife in belief.
Sure.
And I don't know if it's on purpose, okay? So I'm not conspiratorial in that way. I think it was just a confluence of events that came together in the 1960s, and then we no longer have this devotion. You talk to Catholics today, and they go, "Purgatory, is that a place in North Carolina? Isn't there like a Purgatory Hill?"
Is there? There may be.
I think there is,
I think
yeah.
there might be. I think
Yeah.
I've heard that. Well, Diana, your research is incredible. I mean, whether you're talking about the afterlife or life beyond the stars, your research takes us to the intersection of religion and imagining transcendence, what's beyond our lives, and I find that incredibly interesting, and I can't wait to see what you write next. I can't wait for the publication of your book.
Thank you so much.
And thank you again for coming back for a second program.
Absolutely.
Well, that's it for this week. Thank you for joining us here on Religion and Life at App TV. I want to thank again Dr. Diana Walsh Pasulka for coming back for a second interview. And this ends season number 7 of Religion and Life, and I want to encourage you to join us again at the beginning of season 8. Thank you so much.